This is a spoken summary of Frank Dikötter's book, The Tragedy of Liberation, A History of the Chinese Revolution, 1945 to 1957. It is the second volume of Dikötter's People's Trilogy. Although it was published after Mao's Great Famine, it precedes that book chronologically, covering the years that led up to the Great Famine of 1958 to 1962. A third volume on the Cultural Revolution would follow. Dikötter's central argument is stated plainly at the outset. The Chinese Communist Party refers to its victory in 1949 as a liberation, a word that summons images of joy, peace, and justice. But the reality of the first decade of communist rule, the author insists, was very different. It is first and foremost, he writes, a history of calculated terror and systematic violence. The first decade of Maoism, on his account, was one of the worst tyrannies in the history of the 20th century, sending to an early grave at least 5 million civilians. To paraphrase Simon Schama's remark about the French Revolution, Dikötter argues that in China, too, violence was the revolution. The book rests on a large body of previously classified sources. Over recent years, party archives across China were opened, and Dikötter draws on secret police reports, unexpurgated speeches by the leadership, the confessions extracted during thought reform, the statistics compiled during the great campaigns of killing, factory surveys, and letters of complaint from ordinary people. These are combined with memoirs, diaries, and eyewitness accounts, many of which can now be corroborated against the archives. The result is a portrait of the years 1945 to 1957 that runs directly against the romantic notion, long held by some historians and sympathizers, that this was a golden age or a honeymoon period before things later went wrong. Dikötter's point is that the violence was not a later deviation, but was present from the very beginning. A recurring theme is that Chinese communism was a history of promises made and promises broken. Like Lenin, Mao promised every disaffected group exactly what it wanted. To the peasants he promised land, to the minorities he promised independence, to intellectuals he promised freedom, to businessmen he promised the protection of private property, to everyone he promised higher living standards. All of this was wrapped in the language of new democracy and pursued through what was called the United Front, in which parties and organizations outside the Communist Party were temporarily co-opted, among them the various so-called democratic parties. Mao's own strategy, quoted as the epigraph of the book, was to win over the majority, oppose the minority, and crush all enemies separately. One group after another was courted, used, and then eliminated in turn, until nothing stood between the party and the individual. Dikötter closes his preface with a question borrowed from Valentin Chu, whose book, The Inside Story of Communist China, appeared a decade after the conquest. Chu asked whether there was any good that the Chinese communists had done, and concluded that isolated achievements, a working dam here, a good nursery there, the campaign against illiteracy, did not add up to a broad trend toward equality or well-being. That tension between genuine but isolated achievements and a system built on fear runs through the whole book. Chapter 1. Siege. The book opens not in a palace or on a battlefield, but in the black soil beneath the city of Changchun in Manchuria. In 2006, workers digging an irrigation trench there found the earth clogged with human remains, thousands of skeletons stacked in layers like firewood. Local people assumed the bones dated from the Japanese occupation. Only an elderly man recognized them for what they truly were: the civilian dead of the Civil War, buried in unmarked mass graves after the communists took the city. Dikötter uses this act of forgetting as the frame for the chapter, for the siege that produced those bones has been almost entirely erased from official memory. Changchun had been a minor trading town until the railway reached it at the end of the 19th century. It grew as the junction of the Japanese-run South Manchurian Railway and the Russian-owned Chinese Eastern Railway, and in 1932 it became the capital of Manchukuo, Japan's puppet state, with the last Emperor Puyi installed as its nominal ruler. The Japanese laid out a modern, wheel-shaped city of broad avenues. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the Soviet army took the city and stripped it of its factories and machinery, shipping the booty back to the Soviet Union, before withdrawing and leaving the region contested between nationalists and communists. In the spring of 1948, the communist commander Lin Biao laid siege to Changchun. Lin was one of the finest battlefield commanders of the age, gaunt, trained at the Whampoa Military Academy, and utterly ruthless. When the defending nationalist commander refused to capitulate, Lin issued an order on the 30th of May 1948 to turn Changchun into a city of death. Inside were roughly 500,000 civilians, many of them refugees who had been trying to reach the south, along with 100,000 nationalist troops. 200,000 communist soldiers surrounded the city. They cut off the underground water supply, bombarded it all day with artillery and anti-aircraft guns, and, most importantly, sealed it off completely. Lin placed a sentry every 50 meters along barbed wire and trenches 4 meters deep and blocked every exit. Nobody was to be allowed out. The consequences were catastrophic. Only a fraction of the grain the city needed could be flown in, so as food ran out, people ate rotten sorghum, corn cobs, tree bark, insects, and leather belts. Human flesh, Dikötter records, sold for a little over $1 a pound. Refugees who tried to leave were trapped in a no-man's land between the two front lines, a death zone dominated by armed bandits where hundreds died each day. By late summer, more than 150,000 people were pressed into that zone, eating grass and leaves, the stench of decomposition everywhere. Dikötter lets the survivors speak. One woman recalled that they were simply lying in bed starving to death, unable even to crawl, and that she lost her brother, her sister, and most of her neighbors. A soldier who entered one house found a dozen bodies, a girl still embracing a baby, while the clock on the wall ticked on. Chiang Kai-shek, alarmed at the reports, cabled in June to reverse the order forbidding civilians to leave, but by then the two armies were locked in place and the refugees remained trapped in the ground between them. Lin Biao's own report to Mao described refugees kneeling and begging at the sentry lines, some abandoning their babies with the troops, some hanging themselves. Soldiers wept. Some secretly let people through, others beat them back, tied them up, or shot them. One conscript, forced into the army at 15, later recalled being told simply that these people were the enemy and had to die. Inside the city, order collapsed. Soldiers stole food at gunpoint and slaughtered their army horses, then dogs, cats, and birds. As the autumn cold arrived, survivors tore up floorboards, roofs, and whole buildings for fuel, and some 40% of the city's housing was consumed. The siege lasted 150 days. It ended in October 1948, when the starving and divided nationalist garrison collapsed from within, one army turning its guns on another and handing the city to Lin Biao. In China's official histories, this is remembered as a decisive victory in the battle for Manchuria. Dikötter puts the civilian death toll at around 160,000. He quotes an army officer who documented the siege and compared it to Hiroshima. The casualties, the officer said, were about the same, except that Hiroshima took 9 seconds and Changchun took 5 months. Chapter 2. War. The second chapter widens the lens to the whole Civil War. Dikötter's argument is that the nationalists did not lose China simply because the communists were popular. They lost through a combination of factors: Soviet material and strategic backing from Mao, American vacillation and an arms embargo, deep structural weaknesses on the nationalist side, above all hyperinflation and corruption, and Mao's willingness to wage a ruthless war of attrition. The chapter begins with the euphoria of August 1945. The atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered, and celebrations swept across a China that had endured 8 years of a brutal occupation. That war had included the massacre at Nanjing in 1937 and the biological warfare experiments of Unit 731 near Harbin, where prisoners were subjected to vivisection without anesthesia. But peace did not come. The Soviet Union had declared war on Japan just after Hiroshima and poured across the border into Manchuria, advancing up to 70 kilometers a day. At Yalta in February 1945, Stalin had extracted major concessions in China from Roosevelt and Churchill, including the naval base at Port Arthur and control of the railways, and Roosevelt had conceded them without consulting Chiang Kai-shek. Mao's forces at the end of the war numbered perhaps 900,000 guerrilla fighters, hardened since the Long March, of which only some 20,000 had survived, and based in the cave dwellings of Yan'an. Stalin played a double game. Publicly, he backed Chiang Kai-shek, signed a treaty with the national government, and told Mao to avoid open confrontation and consolidate in the countryside. Privately, he armed the communists with captured Japanese weapons and allowed them to occupy the northeast. Moscow later claimed to have handed over 700,000 rifles, thousands of artillery pieces, and hundreds of aircraft. When Mao flew to Chongqing to negotiate with Chiang under American auspices, escorted by the ambassador Patrick Hurley, the two men had not met in 20 years. Mao stayed 6 weeks, publicly proclaimed unity under Chiang's leadership, and signed an agreement that he privately dismissed on his return to Yan'an as a mere scrap of paper. The United States then sent General George Marshall to broker a coalition government. The Communists used the truce to regroup, and Zhou Enlai, whom Dikötter calls a master of deception, cultivated Marshall by presenting the Communists as mild agrarian reformers, even getting Mao to declare that Chinese democracy must follow the American path. Marshall came to believe that Stalin had given up on China. In September 1946, exasperated with Chiang, Truman imposed an arms embargo on the nationalists that lasted the better part of a year. Meanwhile, the nationalist regime was collapsing under hyperinflation, which the war had financed by printing money and which fell hardest on the middle class. Dikötter offers a striking illustration. In 1940, 100 yuan bought a pig. In 1943, a chicken. In 1945, a fish. In 1946, an egg. And in 1947, only a third of a box of matches. By 1949, people wheeled their money about in carts. Corruption was rampant among underpaid officials and soldiers, and American aid, generous to Europe under the Marshall Plan, was comparatively meager for China. The turning point came in Manchuria in 1948. Chiang had gambled his best troops on holding the region, but they were overextended along a sabotage railway, short of ammunition under the embargo, and worn down. Lin Biao's armies, by now well-equipped and well-supplied, besieged the great railway cities. Shenyang, like Changchun, was blockaded for months, its population swollen to millions and reduced to eating bark and fertilizer cakes. The city of Jinzhou fell in October after tens of thousands of casualties. Changchun surrendered, and Shenyang followed. The battle for Manchuria was over by the end of the year, with hundreds of thousands of nationalist troops lost or absorbed. The communists then swept south. Beijing, which was then called Beiping, was surrounded, its water and electricity cut, and after a 40-day siege, the nationalist general Fu Zuoyi negotiated a peaceful surrender, his forces absorbed into the People's Liberation Army. At the end of January 1949, the army entered the city to loudspeakers, congratulating the people on their liberation. At the Huaihai campaign around the rail junction of Zhuzhou, more than 1 million men fought. Deng Xiaoping mobilized roughly 5 million laborers to support the communist armies, and Dikötter records that civilians were used as human shields. One soldier described firing bullets into a sea of people until his hands went numb, and a communist general admitted that in fighting the enemy, they had practically flattened the villages. Chiang Kai-shek, dominant for over 2 decades, stepped down in January 1949. In April, the communists crossed the Yangtze. When the British sloop HMS Amethyst was caught in the crossfire and shelled, with dozens of sailors killed, Mao was delighted, seeing it as the perfect symbol of the end of foreign domination and ordering that no foreign interference be tolerated. Nanjing fell within days, and Chen Yi and Deng Xiaoping took turns, Dikötter notes, sitting in Chiang Kai-shek's chair in the presidential palace. Shanghai fell in May with barely a shot fired, its business community and criminal triad switching sides. Observers were struck by the youth and discipline of the soldiers, many of them teenagers, who slept on the pavements. Newspapers marveled that the soldiers even bought their own tram tickets, and one veteran, then 25, confirmed the stories of country recruits so unused to the city that they tried to wash rice in the flush toilets and to light their cigarettes on electric bulbs. For a moment, at least, discipline had replaced the looting that had marked almost every previous change of power in China. Guangzhou fell in October, and in December Chiang Kai-shek flew to Taiwan, never to return. The final section of the chapter follows the communists into the vast borderlands of the Northwest and the Far West. General Peng Dehuai, described as having the face of a bulldog, led the campaign against the Muslim cavalry of the Northwest, taking Lanzhou and the Yumen oil fields. Xinjiang, incorporated into the empire only in the 19th century and overwhelmingly non-Chinese, with the Uyghurs, the largest group, was absorbed with Soviet cooperation. 5 leaders of the short-lived Eastern Turkestan Republic summoned to Beijing, died in a suspicious plane crash near Lake Baikal. Tibet expelled the nationalist delegation and declared it would defend itself, but 40,000 communist troops invaded in October 1950 and crushed the resistance at Chamdo. Dikötter draws his conclusion in a single sentence. Just as the Bolsheviks inherited a realm conquered by the Tsars, so the Communists could now start building on the empire won by the Manchus. Only Hong Kong and Taiwan escaped the new People's Republic. Chapter 3. Liberation. The third chapter examines what liberation actually meant in the cities in 1949 and 1950. It was staged as joyous celebration, but it quickly became an apparatus of control. Communist rule in each town was inaugurated with parades, soldiers first, then a lorry bearing Mao's portrait, then dance troops performing the rice sprout song. Its traditional body lyrics replaced with revolutionary content, and its complex steps simplified to a few movements. In many places, the very same crowds had cheered Chiang Kai-shek only weeks before. The founding ceremony took place in Beijing on the 1st of October 1949, before a crowd of 300,000 in a Tiananmen Square that was then much smaller and pitted with holes. Mao, then 56, wore the plain suit that would come to bear his name, and spoke in his Hunanese accent, with Madame Sun Yat-sen at his side as a symbol of the United Front. Dikötter is careful to record genuine belief. Mao's future physician Li Zisui, then 29 and just returned from abroad, wrote that his heart nearly burst with joy and that tears welled in his eyes. He had no doubt that Mao was the great leader of the revolution and the maker of a new Chinese history. A student who had joined the party at 15 described being drawn in by youthful idealism and the simple promise of food. But behind the celebration came the police, searching homes for weapons and radios. The regime adopted and expanded the household registration system, once condemned as fascist, tying every family to ration cards and giving the state reach into every household. It introduced class labels, roughly 60 categories ranked as good, middle, or bad. Good classes included revolutionary cadres, soldiers, martyrs, and poor peasants. Middle classes, the petty bourgeoisie and professionals. Bad classes, the landlords, rich peasants, and capitalists. These labels were inherited by one's children and would, Dikötter writes, determine a person's fate for decades. The country was still at war, and executions were carried out quietly. In Hebei alone, more than 20,000 suspected counter-revolutionaries were shot in the first year. The regime also moved to purge the cities of what it called undesirables. Beggars and rickshaw pullers were rounded up into reformatories. Brothels were raided. In Beijing on a single night in November 1949, some 2,400 police arrested more than 1,000 women who were then sent for re-education. Hundreds of thousands of refugees, unemployed people, and former soldiers were sent to the countryside, which became, in Dikötter's phrase, the great dumping ground. Nanjing expelled 1/3 people, a quarter of its population. Others fled in the opposite direction. Around 1 million refugees crowded into Hong Kong, which became a great crossroads, and 1 to 2 million more crossed to Taiwan with the retreating nationalists. Dikötter records the small human tragedies contained within this vast movement of peoples. A mother who left her 1-year-old son at a railway station in the autumn of 1949, and who did not see him again until 1987, when he was a man of 40. And despite the rhetoric of new democracy, the state throttled the urban economy. Punitive taxes and a naval blockade by the nationalists strangled trade. The finance minister Bo Yibo admitted that a punishing tax had ruined the tobacco industry. Thousands of businesses went bankrupt, and unemployment soared. Shanghai, once the most vibrant commercial city in Asia, became, in the words Dikötter quotes, a dying city. There were protests, and in some places people tore down Mao's portrait and left the party. Pleasure was condemned and thrift extolled. Dance halls and cafes emptied. English was banned as imperialist. The press was brought into line, and people changed almost overnight into plain blue and gray cotton. Chapter 4. The Hurricane. The fourth chapter concerns land reform, and here Dikötter makes one of his most forceful arguments. Land reform, he says, was not a spontaneous peasant uprising, nor was it primarily an economic redistribution. It was a deliberately engineered campaign of terror. Its purpose was political, to shatter the traditional bonds of the village, to implicate ordinary people in murder, and thereby to bind the whole population to the party through shared guilt. Mao had been thrilled by peasant violence in his native Hunan in the mid-1920s, and had predicted then that the peasants would rise like a hurricane, a force so swift and violent that no power, however great, could hold it back. When land reform came, work teams arrived in the villages and divided the inhabitants into Soviet-style classes: landlords, rich, middle, and poor peasants, and laborers, distinctions marked in some places by color-coded cloth strips. But these categories, Dikötter argues, did not correspond to the actual social landscape of the Chinese village, which varied enormously across the country. The very word landlord, and the sense the party used it, was largely a Maoist construction, imported and reformulated. He cites the agricultural survey of John Lossingbuck, covering more than 16,000 farms across 22 provinces, which found that more than half of farmers owned their land and fewer than 6% were tenants. One Chinese agricultural expert with a doctorate from Cornell stated flatly that China had no landlord class. The mechanism of terror was the Speak Bitterness meeting, in which villagers were coerced into voicing grievances, and the struggle session, in which designated victims were tortured to force them to reveal hidden assets. Their land, grain, animals, furniture, and even their pots and rags were then distributed by class. One villager, Dikötter records, received a single water jar for his share. The party's security chief Kang Sheng, who had trained with the Soviet secret police during Stalin's purges in Moscow, ran a particularly savage campaign in Shenxi, where landlords were made to kneel on broken bricks and had excrement poured on them, and where in some places 1 in 5 villagers was branded a landlord. Dikötter quotes a report to Mao describing people drowned in vats of salt water and boiling oil poured over victims' heads. In one county, over 2,000 were killed, including elderly people and children denounced as little landlords. In one case, Dikötter recounts, a man of 61 who had actually aided the communist guerrillas had an iron wire driven through his nostrils and was made to be led about like an ox by his own son before he was branded and left to die. The author's point is that this cruelty was not incidental, but was the very mechanism by which the party broke the old village and bound its people to the new order. Crucially, Mao wanted the farmers themselves, not the security organs, to do the killing so that everyone would have blood on their hands. Deng Xiaoping later described how, once killing began, the masses felt ever more insecure and kept expanding the lists of victims, until in the end, they had killed 200 people and ruined all their work in a dozen villages. Dikötter stresses that a peaceful alternative existed and was ignored. One Hunan farmer wrote to the People's Daily, asking, in effect, why Chairman Mao did not simply print some banknotes, buy the land from the landlords, and hand out the shares. In Taiwan, in Japan, and in Korea, land reform was carried out by compensating owners with certificates in stock, and, as Dikötter observes, not a drop of blood was shed. Even Stalin advised limiting the struggle to landlords and sparing the rich peasants. Mao himself called land reform in a population of 300 million a vicious war, a battle to the death. In the South, where there were even fewer landlords, the campaign was driven by brutal grain requisitions and produced open rebellions. By the end of 1951, more than 10 million landlords had been expropriated, and over 40% of the land had changed hands. The author estimates that not fewer than 1.5 to 2 million people were killed or driven to suicide between 1947 and 1952. Agricultural output, meanwhile, fell, and much art and antiquity was destroyed. Chapter 5. The Great Terror. If land reform was aimed at the villages, the campaign of the 5th chapter reached everywhere. This was the campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries, which ran from October 1950 through much of 1951. It was triggered and legitimized by the outbreak of the Korean War, and it was, Dikötter argues, a centrally directed mass killing run by quota, in which Mao personally adjudicated the death rates while posing as a moderate. In the summer of 1950, Mao admitted that the party was hitting out in all directions and making only enemies, and that the leadership was rather lonely. There was some real armed resistance, particularly in the far south and Guangxi, but rather than retreat, Mao used the Korean War as a pretext. On the 10th of October 1950, which happened to be the Nationalists' National Day, he issued a directive to liquidate what he called remnant nationalist forces, secret agents, bandits, and counter-revolutionaries. What followed was governed by an explicit killing quota. Mao's norm was 1 death per 1,000 of the population, though it could be adjusted upward. Some provinces requested 3 or even 5 per 1,000. In Guangxi, in the far south, where the resistance was genuine, the campaign became a grim showcase. The enforcer Tao Zhu reported to Mao that of some 450,000 so-called bandits pacified, 40,000 had been killed, a third of whom, he openly conceded, may or may not have deserved death. He praised a province that had killed 12,000 and planned 20,000 more, remarking that in a province of 30 million, that was a good number. He instructed his subordinates that the terror must be stable, precise, and, above all, ruthless, and that in provinces where too few had been killed, a large batch should be killed. Because Mao was deliberately vague, his underlings competed to guess his intentions and to avoid falling behind, and so the whole leadership became implicated. Mao's overseer of the campaign, the security chief Luo Ruiqing, hung a portrait of Felix Dzerzhinsky, the founder of the Soviet secret police, in his office. Dikötter documents killings driven by personal vendettas, false arrests that in some counties amounted to more than half the cases, and the torture of children as young as 6 accused of being spies. Jails overflowed, and inmates were sometimes executed simply to save time. The terror reached the cities after an assassination in Jinan in March 1951, when Mao demanded several batches of big killings and remarked that the people said killing counter-revolutionaries was even more joyful than a good downpour. On a single coordinated night in late April, raids across Shanghai, Nanjing, and more than a dozen other cities targeted nearly 17,000 people. Public executions were staged, suicides multiplied, with people leaping from buildings, and in Beijing the mayor led crowds in chants demanding execution by firing squad. One cadre told a horrified witness to take a good look, because this was what the revolution was all about. The terror later extended even to the millions of boat-dwelling people of the coasts and rivers. On the totals, Dikötter is careful. The official aggregate given by Liu Shaoqi was 710,000, which the author treats as a lowest possible estimate. Bo Yibo, in the autumn of 1952, spoke of more than 2 million victims, and this is the figure Dikötter regards as most likely for the years 1950 to 1952. Beyond the dead, several million people were sent to labor camps, and tens of millions were permanently branded as members of the black classes, a stigma passed on to their children, who could be paraded and humiliated for decades. Society was left regimented and fearful, sealed off by sentries, searches, and identity cards. One survivor, Robert Lowe, described how friend had been made to betray friend and family members forced to denounce each other, until people came to know the fear of being isolated and of standing helplessly alone before the power of the state. Chapter 6. The Bamboo Curtain. The 6th chapter turns to the destruction of the foreign presence in China and the simultaneous embrace of the Soviet Union. Over the previous century, since the Opium Wars opened the treaty ports, a cosmopolitan foreign community had put down deep roots. Businessmen, missionaries, teachers, advisors, and more than 100,000 European refugees, including tens of thousands of white Russians who had fled the Bolshevik Revolution, and some 20,000 Jews who had fled the 1930s. Christianity was China's 3rd largest faith, with around 4 million Catholic and 1 million Protestant followers, and the missions ran hundreds of middle schools and a dozen colleges and universities. Dikötter quotes the historian John Fairbanks' observation that the treaty port cemeteries are filled with foreigners who understood China well enough to live and die there, and notes that the young China of the 1910s and 1920s was often the product of missionary schools. The chapter opens with a show trial. On the 17th of August, 1951, an Italian pilot long resident in Beijing and a Japanese bookseller became the first foreigners sentenced to death in communist China, convicted in a 1-hour trial of an implausible plot to fire mortar shells at Mao from a reviewing stand during a National Day parade. The evidence was a non-functioning antique mortar found in the Italian's house and a map in the bookseller's notebook that he had in fact drawn for the fire department to which he sold equipment. The alleged ringleader was an American who had moved away a year earlier. The whole affair, Dikötter writes, was a fabrication designed to frighten the foreign community and to scare local people away from any association with outsiders. Some 20 years later, Zhou Enlai apologized to the American whom the plot had named. The persecution was methodical. Foreigners faced extortionate taxes, demands from labor unions, and frozen assets, and were denied exit visas until they surrendered their property. As Dikötter quotes the historian Beverly Hooper, those who had long been humiliated now took every opportunity to humiliate. A vice-consul was beaten and detained for driving on a closed street. A businessman had his passport torn up. In August 1951, a secret resolution ordered the expulsion of all foreigners, except those under arrest, and Tianjin became the sole exit. Missionaries suffered especially. A Trappist monastery was seized, and its monks killed or worked to death. Up to 100 missionaries were killed in the late 1940s. Priests and nuns were imprisoned, some died in custody, and orphanages run by nuns were subjected to grotesque show trials, accusing them of murdering thousands of children in their care, broadcast in several languages. By 1954, only a few hundred Catholic missionaries remained. The wider foreign community was dismembered, piece by piece. The American consul Angus Ward and his staff had already been held under house arrest for a year in Shenyang, then tried for inciting a riot and deported in the freezing cold. When soldiers walked into the bedroom of the departing American ambassador, Mao marked the moment with a mocking editorial titled, "Farewell, Leighton Stewart." After the mass expulsions of 1951, some 25,000 Japanese residents were repatriated through Tianjin, followed by around 12,000 White Russians, many of them stateless people who had already fled one revolution and now had nowhere left to go. A cosmopolitan presence built up over a century, with its churches, schools, newspapers, and cemeteries, was effectively gone within a few years. As the West was shut out behind what Dikötter calls the bamboo curtain, the Soviet Union was embraced. Mao announced the policy of leaning to one side. The experience of the party, he said, had taught that to win victory and consolidate it, China must lean to one side, the side of the socialist camp. But the embrace was humiliating. Mao's first visit to Moscow, in December 1949, saw him given the cold shoulder and left for weeks at a dacha where, he complained, there was nothing to do but eat and sleep. The Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance, signed in February 1950, provided only $300 million in military aid over 5 years, in exchange for major territorial and economic concessions kept in secret annexes, bases at Port Arthur and Dalian, the confirmation of Mongolian independence, mineral rights in Xinjiang, and the exemption of Soviet citizens from Chinese law. One historian, Dikötter notes, concluded that Mao's state was treated in much the same way as the captive territories of Eastern Europe. Soviet imagery was everywhere. Sino-Soviet friendship associations had over 100,000 branches. Stalin's writings were read like scripture. Russian became a compulsory school subject, and the slogan of the day proclaimed that the Soviet Union's today was China's tomorrow. Chapter 7. War Again. The 7th chapter is devoted to the Korean War, into which Mao dragged a population that had been promised peace. Korea, a Japanese colony since 1910, had been divided at the 38th parallel, with Kim Il-sung installed in the north after long exile in the Soviet Union. When Kim invaded the South in June 1950, having won Stalin's cautious approval, Stalin had made clear that if things went wrong, he would not lift a finger, and that Kim must ask Mao for all the help he needed. The South had been deliberately kept weak by the Americans, but a United Nations force under General MacArthur drove the North Koreans back and pushed toward the Yalu River and the Chinese border. Dikötter emphasizes that Mao overrode the reluctance of his own colleagues. Only Zhou Enlai gave cautious support. Lin Biao feigned illness to avoid taking command. Others feared American bombing and even the atomic bomb. Peng Dehuai reluctantly took charge, sleeping on the floor because his bed was too soft, and declaring that the tiger always eats people, and that it was impossible to make any concessions to a tiger. Among Mao's motives, Dikötter suggests, were his rivalry with Stalin for leadership of the Asian Communist movement, and his belief that the Americans had no stomach for a long war. When Stalin reneged on his promise of air cover, Mao said simply that with or without Soviet air cover, China would go in. Zhou Enlai, it is said, buried his head in his hands. Chinese troops crossed the Yalu in October 1950, and in what Dikötter calls the largest ambush in the era of modern warfare, fell on the Americans in a massive night assault in late November. Their suffering was enormous. In temperatures of 30 below zero, Without adequate clothing or padded shoes, whole units froze, and many survived only on rations, sleeping bags, and overcoats captured from the Americans. Mao told Stalin that China had already sustained 100,000 casualties and was prepared for 300,000 more. The American General Matthew Ridgway then launched a grinding counteroffensive, nicknamed the Meat Grinder, that inflicted an estimated 80,000 casualties in the first 2 weeks of February alone, and Peng Dehuai flew back to confront Mao with the scale of the losses. Later, once the fighting had settled into trench warfare and the armistice talks had begun, a pretext for prolonging the war was found in the thousands of Chinese prisoners who refused to be sent home. Many had once served in the nationalist army. Some tattooed anti-communist slogans onto their bodies and wrote their petitions in their own blood, cutting open their fingertips to use as pens. Both Stalin and Mao, Dikötter argues, wanted the war prolonged. Stalin to tie down and bleed the Americans, and Mao to extract weapons and build up his army and arms industry. A pretext for delay was found in the thousands of Chinese prisoners who refused to be repatriated. Only after Stalin's death in March 1953 did an armistice come quickly, with the ceasefire in July. China sent some 3 million men, and roughly 400,000 died. But Mao had, in the phrase of the day, made China stand up, for the first time in more than a century fighting a foreign power, without losing face. The domestic consequences occupy much of the chapter, and here Dikötter's archival material is at its richest. The war was used to fuel campaigns at home. There was a Hate America campaign with forced demonstrations. Dikötter quotes Robert Lowe's account that people rarely knew what the issue was until they read about their own so-called voluntary demonstration in the newspapers. Yet in much of the country, people had little idea what was happening. In some counties, a quarter of people had never heard of Kim Il-sung. There were forced donations to pay for Soviet equipment, extracted even from farmers who had barely enough to eat. One man in Hunan, told that dead or alive he would donate, drowned himself. There was fierce resistance to conscription, with men hiding in the mountains, cutting off their fingers, or taking their own lives. And there was a massive economic burden. In 1951, military spending consumed 55% of the government budget, and relentless grain requisitions in the rear areas of Manchuria, Sichuan, and Yunnan caused man-made starvation, with 1 in 3 villagers going hungry in some regions and reports of cannibalism. The strangest episode is the germ warfare hoax. In the spring of 1952, Beijing alleged that the United States had waged bacteriological warfare, dropping infected flies, mosquitoes, spiders, and rats across the Northeast in some 1,000 sorties. Captured pilots were made to confess, and a commission led by the Cambridge scientist Joseph Needham lent it credibility after finding, Dikötter notes, a single diseased vole. The allegation resonated because of the memory of Japan's Unit 731. A vast public health mobilization followed, with touring exhibitions, along with a campaign against the so-called 5 pests, in which quotas for rat tails created a black market and a cull of the country's dogs. But the whole thing was fabricated. After Stalin's death, Soviet documents recorded that false plague regions had been created, and that the accusations against the Americans were fictitious. Mao was told to cease, and the allegations, Dikötter writes, stopped as suddenly as they had started. Chapter 8. The Purge. The 8th chapter concerns the campaigns of 1951 and 1952, known as the 3 Anti and the 5 Anti. Under the cover of fighting corruption, waste, and bureaucracy, Mao orchestrated a purge that served several purposes at once: to intimidate and control the party, to liquidate the nationalist-era civil servants who had been retained but were no longer needed, and to destroy the independent business class, stripping its wealth to help pay for the Korean War. The chapter opens in a stadium in Baoding in Hebei in February 1952, where 2 senior party officials, convicted of embezzlement, were publicly executed before a crowd of 21,000, shot in the heart as a sign of mercy. Mao personally approved the executions, reasoning that killing these 2 would deter 20, 200, 2,000, or 20,000 other corrupt officials. Dikötter connects this to Mao's obsession with the fate of Li Zicheng, the 17th century rebel who took Beijing only to lose everything to the Manchus within months, and to the Yan'an rectification campaign of the early 1940s, which the historian Gao Hua describes as a device to intimidate the whole party with violence and terror, to uproot any independent thought, and to make the whole party subject to the single utmost authority of Mao. The three anti-campaign hunted for what were called tigers, meaning large embezzlers, distinguished from flies, the small offenders. There were no legal definitions of corruption or waste, only escalating quotas, and tiger hunting teams that tortured suspects and, when they found no tigers, turned on ordinary workers. In one case, a man drank petrol under the pressure. The concealed purpose, Dikötter argues, was the elimination of the retained officials. Close to 4 million government employees were hounded, and tens of thousands were sent to labor camps. One official summary of the campaign found that more than 1 million people had been accused of embezzling some 600 million yuan, that fewer than a fifth of them were even party members, and that at least a tenth of the cases rested on accusations that were simply false. He quotes the observation of one contemporary that those who were corrupt but loyal to Mao escaped with only their money confiscated, while those found to be wavering in their loyalty were killed. The five anti-campaign then declared, in Mao's own words, war on the bourgeoisie, whom he accused of a savage offensive more dangerous than a war. The five sins were bribery, tax evasion, the theft of state property, cheating on contracts, and stealing state secrets. The techniques were adapted from land reform, denunciation meetings, the prying open of account books, loudspeaker trucks blaring at proprietors to confess, and relentless psychological pressure. Dikötter follows the ordeal of the businessman Robert Lowe, who managed the cotton mills of the industrialist Rong Yuren. Lowe was locked in his office for days beneath posters telling him that a complete confession was the road to survival and that anything less would lead to death, and he lost 13 pounds before his 7th confession was accepted. Even the captains of industry denounced one another. Family members were made to inform. One accountant denounced his own father, saying that relatives are not as close as the state. The results were devastating. In Shanghai, Dikötter records 644 people killed themselves in 2 months, more than 10 a day, and the sight of people jumping from windows became commonplace. Most businessmen were not shot, but fined into submission, their wealth transferred to the state to finance the war. In Shanghai, people queued for over a kilometer to sell their gold to pay the fines. The campaign left the economy paralyzed, with cadres frozen by fear, goods rotting, factories running at a fraction of capacity, and unemployment rising across the country. Chapter 9. Thought Reform. The 9th chapter examines the systematic breaking of the minds of China's educated elite, and then of religious believers and ordinary citizens. The model, once again, was Yan'an. There, in the 1940s, idealistic young volunteers had arrived expecting liberty and equality, and found instead a rigid hierarchy in which food, tobacco, and even writing paper were graded by rank, while Mao rode in the only car and lived in a heated mansion. When the writer Wang Shiwei dared to criticize the privileges of the big shots, he was condemned as a Trotskyist, and in 1947 he was killed, reportedly chopped to pieces, and thrown down a well. After liberation, many intellectuals embraced Marxism willingly, and Dikötter records their conversions with care. Distinguished philosophers denounced their own life's work. One wrote 12 separate confessions. Intellectuals were sent to the countryside during land reform to dirty, and then to bloody, their hands. The experience broke some and exhilarated others, one aesthetician feeling hatred flow through his entire body. Then, in October 1951, came a nationwide thought reform campaign, which Mao called one of the most important prerequisites for the realization of industrialization. The scientist Wu Ningkun, newly returned from the United States, listened to a 7-hour speech by Zhou Enlai, and later wrote that it was nothing less than a declaration of war on the mind and integrity of the intelligentsia for the next 40 years. The campaign proceeded through cycles of confession, self-criticism, and denunciation, backed by the constant threat of terror. Party members sat at every dining table and in every dormitory. Confessions were extracted under siege. There were beatings and suicides. The campaign reached even schoolchildren, with authorities in one province admitting the principle of beating one to scare the many. The 1952 reorganization of higher education was used to eliminate all the Christian universities. Dikötter records the confrontation between Mao and the philosopher Liang Shuming, who had dared to say that the peasants lived in the 9th level of hell while urban workers lived in the 9th level of heaven. Mao told him that there were 2 ways of killing people, one with the gun and one with the pen, and that the pen, drawing no blood, was the kind of murderer Liang was. The persecution of the writer Hu Feng, who had compared the party's theories to knives in writers' brains and who was denounced in 1955 as the head of a counter-revolutionary clique and imprisoned for 14 years, generated more than 2,000 attack articles. In the purge of 1955, over 1 million people were confronted with accusations. Dikötter traces the whole method back to the Yan'an rectification campaign of the early 1940s, which had used interrogations, mock executions, and forced confessions until it drove people to suicide, and which by 1944 had claimed to unmask more than 15,000 supposed enemy agents, the overwhelming majority of them invented. Mao had then curbed the violence and let his security chief take the blame, a pattern he would repeat. The campaigns of the 1950s reproduced that machinery on a far larger scale, and across the schools and universities, the suicides ran into the thousands, as teachers were hung up and beaten, and scholars made to confess over and over again until they broke. The chapter also documents the destruction of culture and religion. Books were burned or pulped by the hundreds of tons. In one city, a 3-day bonfire consumed 300,000 volumes. Jazz was banned in Shanghai that had been the music capital of Asia, and solo singing was suspect as bourgeois, while group singing was safe. Buddhism and Taoism were persecuted, monasteries destroyed, and monks killed, even as the official count of monks was frozen for propaganda. Christianity was forced to sever its foreign ties through a so-called patriotic church. By 1954, the number of Catholics had nearly halved, and churches had been reduced from 16,000 to a few thousand. Muslims were humiliated, their graves dug up and mosques defiled, their rebellions suppressed, even as the regime offered a sham autonomy drawn along lines designed to divide and rule. Chapter 10. The Road to Serfdom. The 10th chapter traces how, in only a few years, the party drove the peasantry down a road that ended in collectivization, and, Dikötter argues, in a form of serfdom. The road had several stages. It began with mutual aid teams, of which Dikötter dryly observes that not much of the aid was mutual. Farmers who refused to join were labeled unpatriotic, backward, or followers of Chiang Kai-shek, publicly humiliated, in one case made to wear a lazybones board, and denied the loans they needed. The stages that followed were cooperatives, in which land, tools, and animals were pooled more permanently, and then, in November 1953, the grain monopoly, under which the state bought all so-called surplus grain at prices it set. Dikötter shows that the real driver was economic desperation. The regime faced a huge budget deficit and heavy obligations to the Soviet Union, which took Chinese exports, including rubber and rare metals, in payment for its industrial aid. The Chinese, one official admitted, had asked for everything they wanted and wanted too much, too fast. The monopoly, cloaked in the euphemism of a unified purchase and sale system, left villagers with rations of perhaps 13 to 16 kilos of grain ahead each month. Resistance was widespread, from hidden grain and token payments to pitched battles. Women blockaded granaries, and slogans against Mao appeared. The state responded by stripping people in the cold, staging mock executions, and beating a pregnant woman unconscious. In Tibetan areas of Gansu, people said it was better to rebel than to wait for death by starvation. Dikötter documents recurring famine through these years, in 1953 and again in 1954, each affecting many millions of people who ate bark, leaves, roots, and mud, sold their seed grain, and in desperation bartered their children. He stresses the man-made character of the disaster, brutal grain levies, and northern cadres who ignored local conditions. Officials denied it. A directive issued in the name of Liu Shaoqi and Zhou Enlai in 1955 claimed that among those who shouted loudly about grain shortages, the absolute majority did not in fact lack grain at all. Meanwhile, mountains of requisitioned grain rotted in poorly built warehouses. The final stage came in June 1955, with the extension of household registration to the countryside, which Dikötter compares to the internal passport of the Soviet Union. Peasant status was inherited through the mother, and migrants who left without permission were labeled blind migrants. A mere step, Dikötter writes, now separated the villagers from serfdom, namely the ownership of the land itself. Chapter 11. High Tide. The 11th chapter argues that Stalin's death in March 1953 was, in effect, Mao's liberation. As long as Stalin lived, Mao had chafed under his authority. Stalin had humiliated him in Moscow, had insisted after 1947 on a new democracy that included rival parties, and had urged him in 1950 to spare the rich peasants. With Stalin gone, that external restraint was removed, and Mao, who had brought a second October revolution to a quarter of the world and fought the United States to a standstill in Korea, moved to consolidate absolute personal power at home. He did so first by undermining his colleagues Liu Shaoqi and Zhou Enlai, both of whom had long histories of subordination and self-criticism, and by attacking the finance minister Bo Yibo over a new tax system that he claimed favored the private sector. The bourgeoisie, Mao complained, was being treated as more important than the party center. He demanded that all documents issued in the party's name be shown to him first, warning that otherwise they would be invalid. In June 1953, he proclaimed the general line for the transition to socialism, positioning himself above the party as a shifting yardstick of correctness, and declared that democracy was out and socialism was in. He then engineered the fall of Gao Gang, the powerful boss of Manchuria, whom Mao had brought to Beijing to head economic planning, and had earlier encouraged to gather material against Liu Shaoqi. But Mao distrusted Gao too, and turned on him. He complained that there were now two headquarters in Beijing, remarking that in front of Gao's residence there had been a constant stream of horses and carriages, while in front of his own gate it had been so quiet that one could catch sparrows. Gao was accused of running an anti-party alliance, and after a failed attempt with a gun, took his own life with sleeping pills. Liu Shaoqi was reinstated after a groveling confession, and the road, Dikötter writes, was paved for a socialist high tide. The fall of Gao Gang, Dikötter suggests, taught the entire leadership a lasting lesson in fear, for it showed that Mao could destroy even the most powerful of his lieutenants at will, and that any alliance among the leaders would be treated as a conspiracy against the chairman. His ally Rao Shushi was purged with him. From this point on, few at the top dared to resist Mao openly, and the way was clear for him to drive collectivization forward at whatever pace he chose. In the summer of 1955, Mao overrode the caution of the rural expert Deng Zihui, who had allowed some struggling cooperatives to disband, telling him that his ideas were so stubborn they should be bombed by artillery, and famously mocking those comrades who tottered along like a woman with bound feet, forever complaining that things were moving too fast. This, Mao said, was a war in which they were opening fire on the peasants with private property. Collectivization then accelerated enormously, from around 14% of families and cooperatives in mid-1955 to over 90% within a year, as elementary cooperatives were transformed into full Soviet-style collectives that took the land itself and turned farmers into work-point laborers. In 1956, industry and commerce were nationalized as well. Terrified by the arrest of officials with ties to the business community, and courted by Mao at a charm offensive where he compared their situation to Churchill's fondness for cigars, the industrialists gave way. The businessman Rong Yidan was induced to beg publicly for the transformation of his own enterprises, declaring that he was not satisfied and wanted to walk toward communism. More than 800,000 private owners were, in the language of the day, voluntarily stripped of their property under a redemption purchase policy that, Dikötter notes, involved neither redemption nor purchase, paying about a fifth of the real value. Rong himself was rewarded with high office and protected, but small shopkeepers were ruined down to the baby's crib, and there were once again suicides. Chapter 12. The Gulag. The 12th chapter describes the vast forced labor system that the People's Republic built. The Chinese term is laogai, meaning reform through labor, in which prisoners worked and were simultaneously reformed through study and indoctrination. The nationalists, Dikötter notes, had never held more than about 90,000 convicts, relying on fines, short sentences, and amnesties. The new regime, by contrast, imprisoned people for long terms for the slightest offense. A man received 15 years for grave robbing, and 5 or 10 years might follow the theft of a bicycle, while the label of counter-revolutionary served as a catch-all. After the Great Terror, the camps overflowed. Within half a year, more than 1 million people were in jail, held in appalling conditions, with skin disease, dysentery, and death rates that in some places reached a third of inmates within a year. One public security head declared it better for prisoners to die than to flee. Mao then made a chilling calculation. If the killing were held to a lower rate and everyone above it sentenced to hard labor, the result would be a formidable workforce. He added, revealingly, that it was troublesome to carry out in practice, not quite as straightforward as killing the lot. A network of camps spread across the border regions, from the mosquito-infested swamps of the Great Northern Wilderness to the salt marshes of Qinghai and the mines of the South. By the end of 1951, the prison population had roughly doubled to 2 million. The camps became a microcosm of society, holding everyone from poor farmers unable to repay state loans to captured experts, priests, and prostitutes. 9 in 10 were political prisoners, and many waited years without any sentence, for there were only a handful of judges for hundreds of thousands of cases. An inspector that reviewed the people's tribunals found that even by its own lenient standard, roughly 1 case in 10 was wrong, which meant, in its own words, that innocent people were arrested, imprisoned, or shot, and families broken up and destroyed. In random checks in Gansu and Ningye, up to a quarter of the accused had done nothing at all. By 1955, more than 1 million people labored in the camps, producing hundreds of millions of yuan in goods and hundreds of thousands of tons of grain, and yet, Dikötter notes, more than 1 million inmates did not even cover the cost of their own upkeep. Dikötter argues that the most dreaded aspect of the camps was not physical brutality, savage as that was with its beatings and its poetically named tortures, but thought reform. One long-term prisoner, the English radio operator Robert Ford, described how under a beating a person can retreat into a corner of the mind and fight the pain, but that spiritual torture through thought reform leaves nowhere to go, because it attacks one's very identity. Another prisoner called it the physical and mental liquidation of oneself by oneself. Alongside the formal prison system, there developed re-education through labor, which dispensed with judicial procedure altogether, and the supervision of the masses, under which convicts were paraded through their villages, sometimes hundreds of times. Conscripted corvée labor on great projects, such as the taming of the Huai River, where workers survived on watery gruel and letters home begged for rescue, blurred the line between free and unfree, so that, in a phrase that foreshadows the Great Leap Forward, the country became one enormous labor camp. In the far west, the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps, formed from demobilized soldiers, became a state within the state, with its own courts and prisons, and, Dikötter argues, the foundation of one of the most successful programs of colonization in modern history, transforming the ethnic balance of the region. Chapter 13. Behind the Scenes. The 13th chapter contrasts the image of New China, projected in 1956, with the reality recorded in the archives. By that year, the regime presented itself as triumphant, the war a memory, inflation controlled, unemployment supposedly solved, industry booming. Communism, Dikötter writes, was marketed as all things to all men, flaunting patriotism before the nationalist, dedication before the devout, and revenge before the oppressed. Statistics always trended upward, with favorable percentages and undefined categories. Thousands of foreign visitors were taken on all expenses, paid carefully managed tours. One guest felt like an infant in transit, passed from hand to hand. The industrialist Rong Yiran was turned into a showcase, posing with his contented family, his daughter at the piano, and assuring visitors that the Chinese communists never deceive people. Behind this Potemkin facade, Dikötter argues, lay decline. Monumental public buildings rose in the Soviet style, but they were often thrown up without surveys or proper materials. A new hotel for foreign delegations had dripping taps, ill-fitting doors, and windows that would not close. In the empire of central planning, he remarks, nothing seemed planned. Ordinary housing was neglected or demolished by the millions of square meters. The Shaoqi instructed that workers' dormitories need not be built well, since they would be demolished in future anyway. Workers in the great industrial centers lived in animal pens and caves. In Anshan in Manchuria, in winters of -20 degrees, babies froze to death. There were genuine gains in public health. The mass production of penicillin, garbage removal, inoculation, and epidemic control, but health care was not free. The mission hospitals and charities had been liquidated, and the Government Labor Bureau found that over the past few years, the real income of workers had followed a downward trend. Comparisons with 1937, the peak of nationalist rule, were mostly left unpublished, Dikötter says, for good reason, because they showed that life had often been better 2 decades earlier. A single textile factory in Hankou showed its workers by 1957 eating nearly half as much pork and a third less cooking oil than in 1937, while the rent they paid had multiplied many times over. In the mills, the air could carry harmful particles many times above the Soviet safety limit. In one saltpeter workshop, an internal report admitted, every single worker suffered from poisoning. The chapter ends with the treatment of the most vulnerable. School children were malnourished, and officials justified it by claiming that eating too much grain was wasteful and lacking in communist virtue, and even that boiled water contained calories. The campaigns against pests and against the parasitic disease schistosomiasis largely failed, and rat-tail quotas even led to the breeding of rats. Most disturbing are the pages on leprosy, where Dikötter records sufferers neglected, burned at the stake and buried alive, and in the worst case, at Yongring County in Yunnan in June 1951, roughly 110 patients locked into a hospital that was then set alight, with only 6 survivors. By 1956, he concludes, the hopes of liberation had been dashed, the state treated people as mere digits on a balance sheet, and the country was seething with a discontent about to explode. Chapter 14. Poisonous Weeds. The final chapter turns on Khrushchev's secret speech of February 1956, delivered on the last day of the 20th Congress of the Soviet Party, which denounced Stalin's terror, his purges and deportations, and his cult of personality. Since Mao was, as Dikötter puts it, China's Stalin de-Stalinization directly challenged his authority. At the 8th Party Congress that September, Mao Zedong thought was quietly removed from the party charter. The cult of personality was decried, and Mao was privately angered at Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping for pushing him into the background. Unrest then swept the communist bloc, with the rising at Poznan in Poland, and, most dramatically, the Hungarian Revolution of the Autumn, in which crowds toppled a statue of Stalin, and the government declared its intention to leave the Warsaw Pact, before the Soviet Union crushed the rising by force, killing thousands. In China, too, discontent surged, and its main cause, Dikötter stresses, was the collectivization of private enterprise under the socialist high tide. There were student strikes, hundreds of labor disputes, and rural protests in which, in some counties, up to a third of farmers took back their land. Petitioners reached the capital. A woman appeared at the gate of the State Council with 4 emaciated infants and a sign reading starvation, and a man lit a lantern in daylight to signal that the party was an agent of darkness. Mao's response was a strategic gamble. He repositioned himself as a champion of the ordinary person and of open criticism. In his speech on the 10 Great Relationships, he called for a Chinese way to socialism and mocked those who copied everything from the Soviet Union indiscriminately, judging Stalin 70% right and 30% wrong. Then, in 1957, drawing the lesson from Hungary that a party could become an aristocratic stratum divorced from the masses, he launched the 100 Flowers campaign, inviting the people and the intellectuals to criticize the party's bureaucracy. He reassured his nervous colleagues that the great majority of counter-revolutionaries had already been eliminated, insisted that it was a good thing for students to demonstrate and that the demons and ogres should be allowed to come out, and dismissed critics as merely a few poisonous weeds. His speech on the correct handling of contradictions among the people, played across the country, encouraged many to hope. Robert Lowe recalled that after it, for the first time in many years, he allowed himself to hope. Criticism came slowly at first, held back by cautious officials, and then in a torrent through May 1957. Big character posters appeared on colored paper. Intellectuals attacked the party's monopoly on power, one calling Mao an amateur intellectual, and another writing of how the party dominated the world. In the streets, students created a democracy wall on the anniversary of the May 4th movement, and enormous labor disturbances broke out in Shanghai, involving tens of thousands of workers, dwarfing anything the country had seen. And then Mao reversed course completely. According to his physician, he lay in bed, depressed and apparently immobilized, plotting his revenge. In a text titled, "Things Are Changing," he wrote that the rightists should be allowed to run amok and reach their climax, for now that large numbers of fish had come to the surface of themselves, there was no need to bait the hook. His earlier conciliatory speech was rewritten and republished so that the whole campaign appeared to have been a deliberate trap, designed, in the phrase later used, to lure the snakes out of their holes. The anti-rightist campaign that followed run by Deng Xiaoping, labeled more than 500,000 people as rightists. The criteria were vague and the process arbitrary. Workplaces filled their quotas by drawing lots or choosing token victims, and a 17-year-old was sent to the camps for praising American shoe polish. Families were torn apart, some denounced by their own spouses, and many of the condemned, including devoted party intellectuals such as the writer Ding Ling, were sent to the labor camps of the Great Northern Wilderness, some of them volunteering to renew themselves there. By way of conclusion, Dikötter draws the threads of the book together. The liberation of 1949, he argues, produced not the peace and justice it promised, but a propaganda state that concealed a steep decline in ordinary life. Group by group, Mao had courted and then crushed his enemies. The landlords, the counter-revolutionaries, the foreigners, the businessmen, the intellectuals, and finally the critics who had spoken out during the 100 Flowers. With the party leadership now cowed, no longer daring to question the chairman, and with the cautious economists Zhou Enlai and Chen Yun pushed aside, the last obstacle to Mao's ambitions had been removed. He was, in the word Dikötter uses, ebullient, and ready to launch the great leap forward toward a communist utopia of plenty for all. The book ends with a sentence that binds it to its companion volume and states its darkest theme. Over the next 4 years, tens of millions of people would be worked, starved, or beaten to death in the greatest man-made catastrophe the country had ever seen. This concludes the summary of Frank Dikötter's The Tragedy of Liberation.